I used to be the kind of person who looked for the rational explanation in everything. When a floorboard creaked, it was the humidity. When a draft chilled a room, it was a poorly sealed window. I considered myself a man of science, of hard edges and cold facts. That was before I signed the deed to Blackwood Manor. You see the photos of these places? The sweeping gables, the dark, ivy-choked stone, the way the arched windows look like hollowed-out sockets. And you think it's just Gothic charm? You don't realize that a house can be a living thing, a hungry thing that breathes with a rhythm entirely its own. We bought it for a pittance, a literal fraction of its market value, and the realtor couldn't get her pen back into her purse fast enough once the signatures were dry. She didn't even wait to hand me the keys. She left them on the porch railing and drove away so fast her tires kicked up a cloud of gravel that hung in the stagnant air for 20 minutes. I should have known then. I should have seen the way the local birds didn't nest in the eaves, or the way the very grass seemed to turn yellow and brittle the moment it crossed the property line. But I was blinded by the dream of a legacy, a home that would finally be mine. The first day was an exercise in silence. It wasn't the peaceful silence of the countryside. It was a heavy, pressurized quiet, like the air inside a tomb right before it's sealed. Every footstep I took on the mahogany floors felt like a personal affront to the house, the sound echoing upward into the vaulted ceilings and dying out in the shadows of the rafters. By sunset, I noticed the first anomaly. No matter how many lamps I turned on, the corners of the rooms remained stubbornly dark, as if the shadows themselves had gained a physical density that light couldn't penetrate. I spent the evening unpacking, trying to ignore the sensation of being watched. It wasn't just a feeling. It was a physical prickle on the back of my neck, a weight between my shoulder blades that followed me from the kitchen to the library. I kept catching movement in the corner of my eye, a flicker of something dark darting behind a doorframe. But when I turned, there was nothing but the oppressive, velvet stillness of the hallway. I told myself it was just the exhaustion of the move, the way the mind plays tricks when it's trying to map out an unfamiliar space. Then came the first night. At exactly 3 a.m., the house didn't just wake up, it began to scream in a language of wood and iron. The pipes behind the walls began to hammer with a rhythmic, violent intensity, sounding less like water and more like someone trapped inside the walls, beating their fists against the copper until their knuckles bled. I sat up in bed, my heart thundering against my ribs. And that's when the smell hit me. It wasn't the smell of an old house. It was the cloying, sweet-rot stench of lilies and old blood, so thick I could feel it coating the back of my throat. I reached for the bedside lamp, but my hand froze. The door to my bedroom, which I had locked and bolted with my own hands, was standing wide open. In the hallway, the motion sensor light I'd installed earlier that afternoon began to flicker on and off. Through the gap in the door, I could see a trail of wet, black handprints leading from the top of the stairs straight toward the foot of my bed. But it wasn't the handprints that stopped my breath. It was the sound that followed, a low, wet rasping coming from directly underneath my mattress, and the feeling of a cold, thin finger beginning to trace the outline of my spine through the fabric of the sheets. I didn't move. I couldn't. My lungs felt like they had been filled with lead. and every instinct in my body was screaming at me to bolt, but my limbs were anchored by a primal, paralyzing terror. The pressure of that finger through the mattress was deliberate, a slow, agonizingly steady line drawn from the base of my neck down to the small of my back. It felt less like a hand and more like a shard of ice cutting through the fabric of the world. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the pressure vanished. The wet, rhythmic rasping beneath me stopped, replaced by a silence so absolute it felt like the house was holding its breath, waiting for my next move. I spent the rest of that night huddled in the center of the bed, the lights blaring, clutching a kitchen knife, until my knuckles turned white and the sun finally bled a weak, gray light through the heavy curtains. I tried to tell myself it was a night terror, a vivid tactile hallucination brought on by the stress of the move and the dark history of the house. But when I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my feet landed in something cold and viscous. The floor was covered in a thin, shimmering layer of black bile that smelled of stagnant well water, and the wet handprints I'd seen in the hallway had multiplied, circling my bed in a frantic, overlapping pattern, as if something had been pacing around me while I slept, deciding whether or not to bite. The day brought no relief, only a different kind of dread. The sun didn't seem to brighten the interior of Blackwood Manor. It only highlighted the layers of decay that the previous owners had tried so hard to mask. I spent hours scrubbing the floor, but the black stains seemed to have etched themselves into the very grain of the wood, refusing to fade. By noon, I found myself drawn to the basement. I had avoided it during the initial walkthrough, put off by the heavy iron door and the way the air seemed to grow thick and sour the closer I got to the stairs. But I needed answers. I needed to know what was living in the bones of this place. The stairs groaned under my weight, each step sounding like a dry bone snapping. The basement wasn't a finished space. It was a labyrinth of low-hanging pipes, crumbling stone foundations, and a floor made of packed, damp earth. In the far corner, tucked behind a rusted furnace, I found it. A small wooden door, no more than 3 feet high, held shut by a series of heavy deadbolts that had been installed from the outside. My hands trembled as I slid the bolts back, the metal screeching in protest. Behind the door wasn't a crawl space, but a small, windowless room lined entirely with mirrors, thousands of them. Small, jagged shards and large, ornate frames were glued to every inch of the walls and ceiling. But as I stepped inside with my flashlight, the reflection staring back at me wasn't right. My face in the glass looked slightly elongated, my eyes a fraction too wide, my smile, which I wasn't even making, curling up at the edges in a way that defied the natural structure of human muscle. It was the Thatcher effect made manifest in real life. Every feature was subtly, sickeningly distorted, creating an uncanny valley version of myself that seemed to be watching me with its own agenda. I reached out to touch the glass, my heart hammering, but my reflection didn't move its hand. It stayed perfectly still, its jaw beginning to unhinge further than a human mouth should ever be able to open. I backed out of the room, slamming the small door and throwing the bolts, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I needed to leave. I needed to get to the car and never look back. I sprinted up the basement stairs, but when I reached the top, the heavy iron door wouldn't budge. I threw my entire weight against it, screaming for help, but it felt like I was pushing against a solid mountain of stone. I stopped, panting, and that's when I heard it. It wasn't coming from the basement behind me. It was coming from the other side of the door, in the kitchen. It was the sound of someone whistling a low, distorted tune, the exact melody my mother used to hum to me when I was a child. And then the whistling stopped, and a voice that sounded exactly like my own, but pitched in a hollow, vibrating vibrato, whispered through the keyhole. "I found your car keys," the voice said, followed by the distinct jingle of metal. "But I think I'll keep them. We aren't finished playing house yet." The silence that followed that voice, my voice, was more violent than any scream could have been. I stood there, pressed against the cold iron of the basement door, listening to the rhythmic clink, clink, clink of my own car keys being toyed with on the other side. My mind was fracturing, trying to reconcile the impossibility of what I was hearing with the undeniable reality of the situation. I had always believed that the most terrifying thing a person could face was the unknown. But I was wrong. The most terrifying thing is the familiar, when it has been hollowed out and filled with something predatory. I began to pound on the door again, my fists bruising against the metal. But the person on the other side didn't mock me or shout back. They just started to walk away. I heard the familiar heavy thud of my own boots, the ones I was currently wearing, stepping across the linoleum of the kitchen, moving toward the living room, and then the sound of the television clicking on. It was playing a static-filled broadcast of a channel that hadn't been on the air for decades. I sank to the floor, the damp earth of the basement soaking into my jeans. And for a long time, I just sat there in the dark, watching the thin line of light under the door. I realized then that the house hadn't just trapped me, it was replacing me. Hours bled into what felt like days. Time in the basement didn't move linearly. It coiled like a snake. I explored every inch of that subterranean cage by the fading light of my phone's flashlight, avoiding the mirror room as if it were a literal mouth waiting to swallow me. The walls of the basement weren't just stone and mortar. In some places they felt soft, almost like bruised fruit. I found old, rusted tools half buried in the dirt. Pliers, heavy shears, and a collection of dental instruments that looked like they had been used to harvest more than just teeth. The deeper I dug into the corners, the more I realized that Blackwood Manor wasn't built on this land. It was grown from it. I found a stack of old Polaroid photos wrapped in rotting plastic buried beneath a loose stone. My hands shook as I flipped through them. They were photos of the previous family, the ones who had suffered a tragedy. But as I looked closer, I saw the same subtle, sickening distortions I'd seen in the mirror. Their eyes were slightly too high on their foreheads, their limbs a fraction too long, their expressions frozen in a state of permanent, wide-eyed shock. In every single photo, there was a shadow in the background, a dark, amorphous shape that seemed to be getting closer to them with every subsequent shot. In the final photo, the family was gone, and the shadow was standing alone in the center of the living room, wearing the father's Sunday suit. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The tragedy wasn't a murder or a suicide. It was an eviction. The house decides when you are no longer a guest, and when you are merely raw material for its next inhabitant. I looked at my own hands in the flashlight's beam and gasped. My fingernails were turning a translucent, milky white, and the skin on my palms was beginning to smooth over. the unique lines of my fingerprints fading away as if they were being sanded down by an invisible force. I was losing my identity, the physical markers of my existence being reclaimed by the foundation. Desperation fueled a sudden, frantic energy. I returned to the mirror room, the only place I had left to look. I didn't look at the glass this time. I looked at the floor. Beneath the thousands of shards, I saw a seam in the wood. I clawed at it, my softening fingernails tearing and bleeding, until I managed to pry up a heavy floorboard. Beneath it lay a narrow vertical shaft that smelled of old rain and copper. It was an old well, one that predated the house itself, and as I shone my light down into the abyss, I saw something reflecting back at me from the depths. It wasn't water. It was a sea of eyes, hundreds of them, blinking in unison from the darkness below. I knew then that I had to go down. It was the only way out, or the quickest way to the end. I lowered myself into the shaft, my feet searching for purchase on the slimy stones of the well's interior. The air grew colder, and the sound of the television upstairs faded, replaced by a low, collective humming that vibrated in my very marrow. I climbed down for what felt like miles, my muscles screaming, until my feet finally touched something solid at the bottom. It wasn't stone. It was soft, yielding, and warm. I turned my flashlight toward my feet and realized I was standing on a literal carpet of human hair, miles of it, woven together in a thick, matted floor. And there, tucked into a small alcove in the wall of the well, was a small rotary telephone, identical to the one I had seen in my grandfather's house years ago. It began to ring, a sharp, shrill sound that cut through the humming. Against every shred of my common sense, I reached out and picked up the receiver. I didn't say hello. I couldn't. From the other end of the line, I didn't hear a voice. I heard the sound of my own heart beating, but there was a second heartbeat layered over it, slightly out of sync. And then, a child's voice, small and distorted as if speaking through water, whispered a single question that made me drop the phone into the darkness. "Why did you come back down here? We already let you out an hour ago." The phone hit the floor of the well with a dull thud, disappearing into the matted tangle of hair. But the voice, that wet, underwater whisper, stayed inside my skull, echoing against the back of my eyes. "We already let you out an hour ago." The words didn't make sense, yet they made perfect, sickening sense. If something that looked like me was upstairs, using my keys and whistling my mother's favorite tune, then what was I? I looked down at my hands again, the beam of my flashlight trembling so violently it looked like a strobe light. My skin was no longer just smoothing over. It was becoming translucent, like cheap wax. I could see the blue of my veins, but they weren't pulsing. They were stagnant, frozen in place, as if the blood inside had turned to lead. I felt a sudden, frantic need to touch my face, to see if I still had features. But my fingers felt thick and clumsy, like sausages made of dough. The humming in the walls of the well grew louder, a vibrating choral of 1,000 voices all chanting in a frequency that bypassed the ears and resonated directly in the bone. It was the sound of the house digesting, a slow, rhythmic grinding of a stomach that took decades to finish a meal. I began to climb. I didn't care about the slime on the stones or the way the hair below seemed to snag at my ankles like tiny, grasping fingers. I climbed with a strength born of pure, unadulterated hysteria. Every time I slipped, a chorus of those eyes in the darkness would blink, their pupils dilating in anticipation of my fall. They weren't just watching me, they were waiting for me to become one of them. Another discarded fragment of a soul that the house couldn't quite fit into its new skin. My breath came in ragged, burning gulps, the air down here tasting of copper and ancient, sunless earth. When I finally reached the top of the shaft and crawled back into the mirror room, I didn't stop to look at my reflection. I knew that whatever was staring back at me now wouldn't be human. I scrambled through the small door, bolted it with the strength I didn't know I possessed, and threw myself against the iron basement door. It was still locked. It was still cold. But this time, I didn't scream. I listened. The house was quiet again. The television had been turned off. I pressed my ear to the wood, and for a long time there was nothing but the sound of the wind whistling through the eaves high above. Then, I heard a sound that broke what little was left of my sanity. It was the sound of a vacuum cleaner. It was rhythmic and domestic, moving back and forth across the living room rug. It was the sound of someone cleaning up, of someone making the space their own. I looked around the basement, searching for any other way out, and my eyes landed on the coal chute, a small, narrow metal flap high up on the foundation wall. It was meant for deliveries, not for a grown man to squeeze through, but I was no longer a grown man. I was something softer, something more pliable. I dragged a heavy crate over to the wall, climbed up, and pushed against the rusted metal. It groaned and gave way, revealing a sliver of the night sky. I didn't think about the physics of it. I just pushed my head and shoulders into the opening. To my horror, my ribcage didn't resist. It compressed with a wet, crunching sound, shifting like a bag of broken glass, allowing me to slide into the narrow chute with an ease that should have been impossible. I tumbled out onto the wet grass, the cold night air hitting me like a physical blow. I lay there for a moment, staring up at the stars, waiting for the pain of my shattered ribs to register. But there was no pain. There was only a dull, empty ache. I stood up, my body feeling light and wrong, and looked back at the house. Every window was dark, except for the master bedroom on the second floor. A warm, inviting glow spilled out onto the lawn, and I could see a silhouette moving behind the curtain. It was me. It was the version of me that the house had accepted. It was wearing my favorite sweater, and it was holding a glass of wine, looking out at the woods with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. I felt a surge of rage, a desperate need to reclaim what was mine. I ran toward the front porch, my footsteps making no sound on the gravel, and reached for the door handle. But as my hand touched the brass, the light in the bedroom flickered. The silhouette in the window turned. It didn't just turn its head. It twisted its entire body around with a snap of bone that I could hear even from the lawn. It pressed its face against the glass, and even from that distance, I could see that it didn't have eyes anymore. Where the eyes should have been, there were only two jagged vertical slits that were weeping a thick black fluid. The thing that looked like me began to smile, its mouth widening until the corners reached its ears. And then it did something I will never forget. It raised a hand and pointed directly at me, and as it did, I felt a sharp, searing pain in my own chest. I looked down, and through my translucent skin, I saw a black, thorny vine beginning to grow out from my heart. its roots wrapping around my lungs and stitching themselves into my flesh. I looked back at the window, and the thing was gone. The front door didn't just unlock. It swung wide open, inviting me back in. And from the darkness of the hallway, my own voice, perfectly clear, perfectly calm, called out to me. "You forgot to lock the basement door, didn't you? Now something else is coming up the stairs." I stood on the lawn, but the lawn was no longer the earth I knew. The grass felt like wire against my translucent feet, and the sky above, once a vast, starlit expanse, now looked like a painted ceiling, low and suffocating, as if the entire world had been folded into the floor plan of this house. The black vine in my chest pulsed with every ragged breath I took, its thorns hooking into my ribs and pulling me toward the open front door. I tried to scream, to call out to the neighbors I knew were only half a mile away, but my voice didn't make a sound. It was as if the air itself was refusing to carry my vibrations, a vacuum of silence that only the house was allowed to fill. I looked at the dark woods surrounding the property, thinking I could run, but the trees didn't look like trees anymore. They looked like the jagged, splintered pillars of a basement, their branches reaching out like the skeletal fingers I'd felt through my mattress. There was no escape because there was no away. Every path led back to the porch. Every direction was a hallway. I was a prisoner in a reality that was being rewritten in real time, and I was the ink being used to fill the pages. The jingle of my car keys echoed from the darkness of the foyer, a mocking invitation. I walked back inside because my body no longer belonged to me. It was being piloted by the roots in my heart. As I crossed the threshold, the front door didn't just close, it fused with the frame, the wood grain knitting together until there was no seam, no handle, no hope of exit. The house was a sealed tomb now. I moved through the living room, passing the television that was still humming as that ancient gray static. In the reflection of the screen, I saw myself, or what was left of me. I was a hollowed-out shell, a pale, flickering ghost of a man whose features were melting away like a candle left too long in the sun. But the me standing at the top of the stairs was perfect. He looked down at me with eyes that weren't eyes, but windows, into a place of infinite, cold hunger. He adjusted my favorite sweater, his movements fluid and graceful, a sickening contrast to my own jerking, mechanical steps. "Don't look so surprised," he said, and the voice was so rich, so human, it made my own internal thoughts sound like a lie. "The house doesn't like waste. It just needed a better version of you to keep the legacy alive. You are just the raw material, the rough draft." Then came the sound from the basement. It wasn't the whistling this time. It was a wet, heavy, slapping sound. The sound of hundreds of feet made of matted hair and weeping sores climbing the stairs. The something else had arrived. I turned to see them pouring over the banister, a tide of those distorted faces from the Polaroid photos, their limbs elongated and clicking, their mouths unhinged in a permanent, silent shriek. They didn't attack me. They simply surrounded me, their cold, translucent hands reaching out to touch the black vine growing from my chest. I realized then that they weren't monsters. They were the previous drafts. They were the ones who had signed the deeds before me, the ones who had thought they were buying a home and ended up becoming the insulation. They were welcoming me into the collective, the silent chorus that lives in the crawl spaces in the walls, The ones who make the floorboards creak and the pipes hammer at 3 a.m., they were the us I had been invited to stay with. The tragedy wasn't that I was going to die. The tragedy was that I was going to remain. I felt my legs begin to stiffen, my skin hardening and turning the color of aged oak. My arms stretched out, my fingers lengthening and splintering until they brushed against the ceiling rafters. I wasn't being murdered. I was being integrated. I felt my consciousness begin to thin, spreading out across the floorboards, flowing into the electrical wiring, becoming a part of the very air that new, unsuspecting families would breathe. I looked up one last time at the thing that was wearing my life, watching as it walked into the kitchen to make a pot of coffee, whistling that same distorted tune. It was a beautiful life, and it wasn't mine anymore. My last human thought was a flicker of pity for the people who would see the for sale sign in 30 years and think they had found a bargain. I tried to scream a warning, but all that came out was a low, heavy creak of a floorboard under the weight of a shadow. I am no longer a man. I am the silence between the heartbeats of 114 Blackwood Lane, and I am very, very hungry.